Valued listeners, welcome to another episode of the Paleoconnection, and today we will be discussing a very interesting article which accuses conservatism of being the battered housewife of capitalism. I found this article to be particularly interesting considering how we have much more of a populistic movement in conservatism these days that is questioning a lot of our traditional relationship with capitalism. And we're really entering sort of a new phase where conservatism is really struggling to see what it is going to be for the rest of the 21st century. So here on the Paleoconnection, where we're essentially kind of named after our paleoconservative roots, I figure it would be a perfect occasion and a great article for us to discuss capitalism and conservatism. So right off, I'd love to ask Brandon, do you think there is any relationship between conservatism and capitalism?
Hello, everybody. And yes, to answer your question, Verv, I do think there is. And I think the reason for that nowadays is because I think liberals, generally nowadays, are more associated with socialist principles, and I think a lot, and by that liberals, I don't mean like, classical liberals. I mean like liberals in the sense of like lefties today. I think they're more associated with, social democracy, socialism, even the far left being communism. And I think that naturally, due to this kind of modern dichotomy that we have in politics, where the left seems to push more for socialist principles, the right then has sort of taken a stand for, free enterprise and capitalist principles, which you would have to say is now the conservative economic system, since that is what has been in place for the, in the U.S. at least for, the last 250 years or so, and in the West in general. The last 200, 250, 300 years. So in a sense, I think because of the modern push towards socialism, and since conservatism is sort of, I guess you can say it's sort of a commitment to the traditional, or, it tries to not change as much. So the change would be the move towards socialism, and the traditional economic approach would be capitalism. So in that sense, if you're trying to maintain the traditional aspects of your society in the U.S. and in the West, it has been capitalism. And I think conservatives are trying to conserve that as much as possible. And I also believe that, private ownership is also something that conservatives, it's a value that conservatives deeply hold. And, of course, that is highly connected with capitalism and the free market. So those would be, my takes on how conservatism these days is, closely connected to capitalism.
And I agree with a lot of that. I think it's very true that has definitely been the norm. But I sometimes think that the most true blue conservatism might actually be that which came before the French and American revolutions, so to speak, which is kind of a radical statement in and of itself. And, we don't have to go that far. It's very silly to talk too much about monarchy as having this, we're going to bring monarchy to America now or something like that. That's a little bit silly. But rather, I'm just suggesting that when we think too much about the American and French Revolution in terms of Enlightenment ideals, we tend to start enshrining things like property rights in really strict ways that people didn't necessarily conceive them of before. And so I would say that we should be more willing to part from some of our ideas about property, because the government on some level has to protect us from the tyrannies and excesses of capitalism sometimes. This is kind of an argument that liberals often use, but when they wrote the Constitution, they always say, the Second Amendment never envisioned assault rifles, right? Well, you could also say that our previous love of the free market didn't really envision a lot of things that capitalism would bring. And that's also why at the end of the 19th century, you had a lot of laws being put in place in Washington, D.C. to prevent monopolies and to try to rein in these major corporations more. And so maybe the 21st century, the big fight that we're going to have at the start here is going to be trying to rein in social media and tech tyranny, if you will. So perhaps this article will help us cover some of that, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And just to go back to what you were saying in the beginning, I definitely agree with you that, yeah, there is another form of conservatism, which, as you said, like pre-French Revolution, especially where, people were monarchists, or, they generally believed in the separation of classes, like in the French Revolution. Before the French Revolution, they had the three estates, and it was definitely messed up, in my opinion, and France needed a change. But post-French Revolution, yeah, we do have a new form of conservatism, which is, I guess, the conservatism I would be referring to. And, right, you have this new system in place, right? And so I guess the supporters of modern conservatism would be supporters of sort of the traditional beliefs post-French Revolution and American Revolution. That's why I think a lot of conservatives nowadays support, the American Constitution, and they don't really want it to change and adapt too much. They don't necessarily believe in it as a living, breathing document, and they sort of try to go back to the age right after the revolutions, and that was the conservative period. And then obviously liberals now are progressing from that moment and progressing towards things like socialism. So yeah, you're certainly right that there is an earlier form of conservatism, and it would be interesting to talk about that perhaps in another show. And I know you definitely have some ideas about that yourself. But yeah, in my sense, I'm talking about conservatism as in sort of the early post-American Revolution. And to talk about what you were saying before about monopolies, I think this is one area where I'm going to slightly disagree with the article, and I think maybe you'll support it more. And I definitely know that monopolies are a problem, and I think that any person who really supports capitalism would also admit that. I think even like Milton Friedman, for example, who was a libertarian, one of the things he said, of course, was that one of the government's roles was to, prevent monopolies and to make sure that there was enough competition. So I think just about anybody who supports the capitalist system would admit that monopolies can be a big problem. Now, we haven't really talked much about the article yet, but I think you'll probably quote it soon after me. And one of the things that the article talks about basically is that, due to these monopolies, the article almost seems so that we should throw away the baby with the bathwater. And in my opinion, we should just get rid of the monopolies, and I know that's easier said than done. And it's a bigger problem these days, I think, with the tech monopolies. It's going to be really hard to figure out how to do that successfully. But I don't think we should just get rid of the whole system. I think we should pinpoint the things that we need to change. And I definitely agree that one of those things is the tech monopolies right now. I don't know how we can change it, but I do agree we need to change it. So,
Well said.
go ahead. Back to you.
Excellent. So let's now jump into the article, and right away we're actually going to read a quote dealing with capitalism and whether or not it's natural. Quote, "There is nothing more or less free with capitalism in that sense than with any other economic system. In every single one, the sovereign establishes the norms necessary for the system to function. Similarly, rules and regulations of the system are also embedded in this moral, political background. They do not make a system less free, simply more or less right." So basically, because capitalism itself ends up being something that is protected by a state, we can't necessarily think of it as natural. I do fully agree with this. It is just, to me, a matter of fact observation. Do you have any position on this?
Yeah, so I agree that capitalism isn't natural. I mean, I don't know really how you could actually say what is natural. I don't know, like, how do you confirm what is natural and what isn't, but I would agree that capitalism probably isn't natural. But the part of this quote that I disagree with is that that it says there is nothing more or less free with capitalism than any other economic system. I don't know why it says this, because, well, clearly capitalism is more free than communism in a few ways. You know, for example, owning property. So would we not say that, okay, capitalism has its rules set forth and laws set forth by the government, and communism has its, laws and rules set forth by its government? Now, according to capitalism, one of the fundamental, things is that you can own property, and with communism, it's sort of publicly owned or collectively owned. So in my opinion, based on that, that is one way that capitalism is more free. I'd like to hear your opinion on that, and tell me if I'm wrong, but why isn't it more free in that regard? Like, if you can own property and you can own property, isn't owning property more free than not owning property?
Sure. I think the article, it's going to talk a bit more about things like freedom of association later on. And I don't think, the guy who wrote it would necessarily be supportive of any kind of communist system. So, I think you'll get a little bit more into why he would think that other systems can actually be more free later on in the article. But what I would also like to say is it seems to me like it could be potentially very natural if, say, we're all Norwegians. We discover oil off of the coast of Norway through a geological survey in the 1950s. I don't know when exactly they originally discovered it, but let's say they discover the oil. Then I think it's pretty natural to say, okay, we are not actually going to sell this big oil field to anybody. We are going to have it mined by a national company, or we're going to, have other companies pay us for the privilege of mining it, and we are going to collectively benefit economically from the oil field that we have here. That seems to be a kind of natural thing. So I kind of think that there are ways to even envision our economy naturally forming in a way that isn't capitalistic, but rather treats our natural resources as being public property. Do you have any counterpoints on that?
Well, I would agree that I think natural resources is a tricky thing, because, as you said, if you could somehow, I think Norway, it's a good example and a bad example. I mean, it's a good example in that, yes, they actually did that with the oil, but it's a bad example in that I think it's a really small country. Everyone's very like-minded, and I don't think it takes a lot of, political leverage to accomplish something like that, right? Whereas if this sort of thing, was just sprung upon, the American public, let's say, 10 years from now, it would be something extremely difficult, to get past the public, right? Because you have all these competing interest groups that are entrenched, and it's it seems to me that it would, like, nobody can agree on anything these days. Like, making such a massive change like that in a system like the American system currently is just like a no-go. Now, if we could somehow, rewind time and go back to like the beginning of the creation of the American Republic, and they put something like that in the Constitution, right? And it was something that just started from the get-go, then yeah, I would agree that that very well could provide, more freedom per se, in that, because everybody's benefiting from it, and we're earning more income, which allows us more freedom in that. I could see how that would be a benefit, but it's just something like we just would have to change too much in the system for it to actually, be an actual thing that we could have nowadays, where, Norway, they accomplished it in a country that is just, it's hard to compare to Norway, right? The Scandinavian countries in general.
Sure, yeah. We're not in a position, that's not been our policy. So implementing something like that now would be very difficult. Yeah, I see what you're saying. However, just my only point on that is that I can see how some amount of collective ownership can be a natural conclusion that people do come to. So let's just kind of move along now, and let's talk a little bit more about what he thinks about things like freedom. The article says in it this very interesting line that freedom of association should not be limited to the rich, which ties a lot into a lot of our conversations these days with deplatforming, doxing, our relationship with the internet, tech tyranny, etc. The quotation is, "When a small set of businesses hold huge amounts of power, the rest of the economy has to play by their rules. Coercion is not simply a state phenomenon. It is a result of power imbalances, and these imbalances can result in the purely private realm taking over, basically." And that's the end of the quotation. He also adds the following juicy lines. "No one who genuinely holds freedom as a core value can defend the tyrannical nature of our jobs. We need to be able to have a say in our lives, in the same way that no taxation without representation was a rallying cry during the revolution. We should apply the same principle to our workplaces. No longer should we suffer under the tyrannical reign of bosses and HR ladies." End quote. Two very juicy ideas there. What are your thoughts on them?
So the first thing I kind of wondered when I read this was, is he just talking about like cancel culture, do you think? Or is he, like with the second quote you read, is he also talking more about, the fact that, office jobs they tend to be, draining, like soul draining, and, people don't find a lot of, value in spending, 10 hours a day in the office, and, suicide rates are higher and whatnot because of that. Is he talking about that nature of our jobs as well? Or is he do you think he's just focusing on like cancel culture?
So later on in the article, he does talk about how the work weeks are too long, in that we end up not having the ability to enjoy our free time as much as we should be entitled to do so. So he definitely gets into some of these socialistic themes. But, since he's kind of trying to pitch this at conservatives, right? And I think that one area that we could definitely get on board now that we're really feeling the negatives of it is, I really agree with the idea that our jobs can end up being tyrannical when we suffer from cancel culture and from the ability of people in HR to just be like, hey, someone dug up a bad tweet of yours from 8 years ago, and because some people have threatened to notify our clients about it and just have been up in our business, they want us to fire you. That's one of the things that I think can be tyrannical about the marketplace, and it's definitely now, as I see it, something that is happening as a result of our capitalistic economy.
Yeah, well, I think it's more than just a capitalistic part of our economy, but I definitely agree that, yeah, the cancel culture part of what's going on these days is very tyrannical in that. And I think kind of what he's trying to say here is, right, we're supposed to have the freedom of association, right? Meaning that, I could hang out with whomever I want, let's say on the weekends, let's say I wanted to hang out with white supremacists or something like that. But then when I went into work the next week, I didn't talk about it. I just like kind of went on with my, daily routine, and I didn't, it didn't affect me in any way, with my job. But if that was ever found out, right, due to cancel culture, I would be fired from my job, right? So in a sense, we don't really have freedom of association because the private companies, right, they could, make their own rules, right, and they could cancel you. And for that, right, we really don't have freedom of association, right? It's in a sense, we have to follow the rules of our company, right? And they can make up anything they want, right? Because it's a private company. Well, not anything, right? There are some things that they can't do, but they can be far more restrictive than the federal government can be. And in that way, I definitely agree with it. And I forgot what was I going to say. I'll throw it back to you, and then I'll come back in on it.
Yeah, so I actually was just looking at it again, and the very next line after the quote about HR ladies was, "I should not be concerned about being fired because I said the wrong thing on Facebook," right? So he is in this situation speaking directly about the idea of workers essentially having the right not to be fired. Something kind of interesting on that is that Antifa in Europe has actually different tactics than it does in the US, because in Europe they have lots of laws where you can't get people fired or economically destroyed because of their political associations and beliefs. So instead, you hear a lot of stories about these guys trying to just go and vandalize people's houses or beat them up and stuff, because ultimately, if you dox somebody, it doesn't really give you a right, at least in most of Europe, to get them fired. You actually have all kinds of programs designed to ensure that people do not suffer unfairly economically. And it would kind of, I think, be something that I would really support for America. Other little known fact is that it's apparently the case that New York and California, these two states, do have laws which explicitly state that one's political activities in your personal life can't be reasons to get you fired. So in some places in the U.S. this already does exist, which is kind of nice. And I would definitely support some federal laws that gave us not just the right to not be fired, but also required major social media platforms to not restrict our personal freedom, like what you saw in Poland, where if it's something is legal to be said in Poland and Facebook removes it, then it's considered then it is considered a violation of Polish people's rights. Would you support going as far as Poland went?
Well, I think what we should do is, you kind of mentioned it, the federal government needs to bolster, freedom. I think they need to improve and bolster our freedom of association and speech rights. So like you said, I don't think there should be necessarily laws that make it harder for you to get fired per se, but I think you can kind of do that not directly, but sort of indirectly by, buffing those freedom of association and freedom of speech laws. So there should be laws, I think, that do say, right, if you say something and it's not against the law, right, then you should not be able to be fired for that, right? And if you do associate with someone and that is not against the law and it's not affecting your job in any way, for example, like I said, let's say you want to hang out with some white supremacists on the weekend and you come to work and it has no effect, then you cannot be fired for it. Now, of course, let's say you start, saying white power or something like that in the office, and you can clearly see that this freedom of association that you have is influencing your work, then okay, maybe you can be fired for it. But yeah, the federal government needs to target laws for things like that, and I would definitely be for it. I think you said New York has it, and what you mentioned, Poland has something
California.
similar. And
yeah, excellent.
Well, I remembered also what I wanted to say before, and it also is mentioned in this article, and it refers to like exiting or like leaving, right? We have the freedom. One of the things we have the freedom to do in capitalism is to just leave a job, right? Like if we don't like the job, if we do really want to continue hanging out with those white supremacists, but at this current job they have a problem with it, well, then you have the freedom to leave and work at a job where they don't have a problem with it. Well, I do agree with the article in the sense that the way things are working nowadays, where everything is so highly specialized, and because of cancel culture specifically, it is very difficult to just leave a job and to just start up. Like, so for example, let's say you're a computer programmer, right? You spend your entire, university, and let's say perhaps you get, a master's degree or something, or even a PhD, and you spend everything in your life is related to that field, right? Computer programming, and you're only working in that field, and you're at a company for like 10 years, and like that's all you know how to do, right? If for whatever reason, cancel culture, let's say you're getting fired from that job, or they're trying to push you out, not only can you just not switch to another field, but even within that field, the way cancel culture works, like you would, your name is sort of dragged through the mud, right? So perhaps other companies might not want to hire you. So you really don't have the freedom anymore to just leave and work at a place that, fits your lifestyle more. There's not going to be a place that fits your lifestyle. And I'm not even talking about like someone who's a hardcore white supremacist. I'm just saying somebody who perhaps wants to associate with, what's not the norm these days. Or let's say they're even like a Christian, they're a conservative Christian, right? These days, if you believe in, if you're pro-life, that sort of thing could possibly get you fired from a job nowadays. These aren't really extreme things. But even having those types of views could affect you, and you would not be able to just freely exit and leave and get a new job. So I do agree with the article in that sense, for sure. Back to you.
Excellent. So, we see them making some good points here. The article then goes on to talk about how capitalism can actually begin to subvert and devour tradition and the family values that conservatism usually advocates for. It states that ultimately capitalism, in its insatiable pursuit of profit, will devour anything it cannot commodify and replace it with a commodified alternative. Capitalism takes one of two approaches towards these goods that make life worth living. Either it doesn't care about them, and they will therefore toss them away the moment it can institute a commodified alternative with a sufficient rate of return, or it openly despises them. Woke capital is a thing for a reason. Get woke, go broke is a massive cope from losers. You are either a number in a spreadsheet to these people, or you are an enemy to be bulldozed. Businesses are not your friend, which touches on the fact that a lot of these major corporations, they don't look at things that we find to be questionable, like, for instance, music that is suicidal and depressive, that targets teenagers, a specific demographic of teenagers, as being a net negative for teenagers. They see that as an opportunity to market it to teenagers. Likewise, businesses are always trying to make pornography available for people. It's everything is commodified ultimately, and of course some things can't be directly attacked. I mean, how do you negatively commodify Christianity and attack it directly? Well, they do still kind of do this in a way by turning Christmas into a holiday that's purely about consumerism, right? So you can kind of see how capitalism can begin directly fighting the traditional values that a society has by commodifying everything, and also by, this doesn't really touch on it, but by trying to get as many people into the labor force as possible. This could be a whole other episode, but basically when women entered the workforce completely, it sort of changes the way that the nuclear family would function for forever, and all family will never be the same. It sort of enables people to get divorces for much less reasons, and it creates also a place where people won't necessarily even get married because they're now married to their job. Do you have any thoughts on that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so this is something that I'd say mostly disagree with. Now, I know that capitalism certainly, like if you look at modern American capitalism, there certainly seems to be an opposition for tradition, the family, and religion. But I think if you expand this out into some other countries and then the way the U.S. used to be, I think this critique falls flat a little bit. So, let's take America in the 50s or 60s. Now, I don't think anyone would really say that America, which was, of course, capitalist then, opposed tradition, family, or religion. I would say that America very much was still a religious country. We have the stereotypical view of, a family, two kids, two parents, a dog, a white picket fence, like most women stayed at home. The traditional family was sort of, that we view as conservatives, was ever present at that time period. And then, of course, just tradition in general, I think, was alive and well at that time period. So I don't think that this really applies to the United States at all times. Now, I would say other things like perhaps feminism, which had a big impact on the U.S., sort of had a large, wearing away on these things, tradition, family, and religion. I would blame feminism more. I guess you could say, well, feminism is like a natural expectation of capitalism. Like eventually feminist movements will always happen in any capitalist society as time goes on. I guess you could perhaps argue that, but perhaps you could not as well. So let me give you an example, like Japan. So Japan is a capitalist country, but feminism isn't really something that has, really caught hold there even yet in 2020. And I would say that Japan, I think most people see Japan today as a very traditional society still. I think there is more emphasis on the family. I think there are more women who stay at home. And I think although religion isn't really a big thing in Japan, I think the first two of tradition and family do seem to still be holding strong in that country. And then the last thing I would say, and I know this is not actually what the article is always comparing to, like socialism or communism, but it's hard to like not break out of that dichotomy, right? Like there really isn't any other, like the modern economic thought really is like, it's just a spectrum, right, of communism on one end and like laissez-faire capitalism or something on the other end, right? That's kind of like what we're in. Like there isn't really another solution. Now I know we might say things like monarchy or something like that, or an oligarchy, and economic systems built around that, but really all that we kind of have right now seems to be communism and capitalism. So like using that dichotomy, right, it's hard to look at the other end, with communism. Let's just take China, for example, right? Communists in China, they tried to, get rid of tradition through the Cultural Revolution, right? They tried to create entirely their own traditions. Family, well, the one-child policy, I think that's one way to, destroy families. And then, of course, religion, communist societies in general are very famous for getting rid of religion and making a religion of the state, and atheism sort of the way to go. Obviously, the Soviet Union was like that as well. And as I said, I know this is not exactly what it's comparing it to, but unless the author really does offer another choice, it's almost as if we do have to compare it to like socialism and communism, don't we?
Sure. Well, I would guess that the author's ideal alternative would be some, more of the sort of economic policies that you see in Northern and Western Europe, which are generally successful. So, well, depends on how you define success, right? We'll see where these go in the long term.
I was thinking that too, but then even if you say that, right, then, religion, like Western European countries are, they're getting less and less religious every day, right?
That's true.
In the family, I mean, there's some countries like perhaps Italy, they're sort of well known still for having, an emphasis on family, but it's not something that I look at Western European countries for, for like examples, right? Like countries that have, great family lives. Now I know, like, if you want to count like vacation time and stuff, more vacation time as a way to say that they care more about the family. Okay, I can see that. And then tradition, to me, there's just a movement in Western Europe, especially these days, away from like their traditions, right? Like
that's right.
It's the same thing in the U.S. It's like, oh, our traditions are icky. It's all about colonialism, and we got these statues around of all these old white men. Let's get away from that and move to something different. So even in those countries these days, I don't see like tradition and family and religion being emphasized in those countries.
I think that this is because of the fact that they've just been fully secularized, and I guess they're dominated by their center-left narratives. It might also just be because while we think of them as, they are socialistic in many ways, but I believe in Sweden's prime minister says we are a capitalist society, but we just have a very robust welfare state. So we're really kind of getting into some difficult territory here where there's a lot of room to define and discuss this from different angles. But I think, we could really do an episode in the future about what has caused a general decline in religiosity and what would be the alternatives for it. But I do have to admit that you really have presented a really good argument that there is no other solution necessarily for bringing back traditional values. But I do side with the author that woke capital definitely has been dominating the last more than 10 years. And maybe the only reason why we don't see it as woke capital existing before is because of the norms of our time. And because we just don't have that much expert experience in what was happening back then. Maybe a good example would be going back and seeing what was happening in like the 60s, 70s, 80s. So there was that show, the Mary Tyler Moore Show, which was kind of revolutionary because it was about these girls in the early 60s that moved to, I think it was Milwaukee, and they're living all by themselves. They're living alone. And then before too long, you get to the show in the 1980s, Murphy Brown, which is all about a woman who can basically have it all. She's completely single. She adopts a boy. And it's kind of, they come up with these sort of propagandizing shows. You could probably find other examples where they discuss divorce positively. So woke capital might have been something that really always existed. It's just we don't think it's so woke that they may have been pushing to us concepts of women living alone and divorce in the 50s and 60s and stuff like single women adopting children in the 80s. But maybe it's always been there. It's always been pushing. And it could be the case, I'll never forget it, that, grandma and grandpa would say that their own parents said that Elvis on TV shaking his hips is going to lead to a moral downfall of the United States. And we kind of laugh about that. That sounds so naive. But in the year, in the 90s, you have far worse things happening on MTV and all these other channels. Shaking your hips on TV is really quite a nobody would complain about that, right? I mean, it would be very tame. So I think there is kind of a way to view wokeness and this social leftism as something that does progressively come from capitalism. But at this point, maybe we should just push on to the next topic. Do you have any final remarks on this?
Yeah, I would just like to say that even though I guess I'm not that well informed about this particular issue, but I would push back a little bit and say that, I fully agree with all the examples you gave, but I think all the examples you gave were like from Hollywood, basically, or the entertainment industry, right? So I definitely agree that Hollywood and the entertainment industry has been woke, basically, I don't know, since its inception, like you said. And there has always been a push of like liberal ideas and feminism and whatnot, and the gay agenda, whatever you want to say, LGBTQ issues. I think that has always sort of been present in the entertainment industry, but I'm less convinced that it has always been a part of just other industries. Like, for example, Gillette, the modern day razor company selling razors with commercials that basically tell men that they are, anti-women or something like that. To me, it seems like people have put their finger on something that actually has sort of developed in the last like 20 years, whereas like in the past, your average, razor company, they just sold razors, and they really, obviously they had advertising and stuff, but it wasn't woke per se. And then in the last 20 years, it seems like something has changed with like the other industries. Like they have gone along with Hollywood and the entertainment industry. Now everything is sort of like how Hollywood and the entertainment industry has always been. So that's the only thing I would say about it.
Very good points. And we'll maybe have to try to do a deep dive on the history of Hollywood and woke capital in the future. This is a really interesting topic. So just to kind of close this up, let's look at this last little quote here. They say that it has been argued that the right will not stop losing until it decides to fight for its beliefs with the same kind of fervor that the progressives fight for theirs, unquote. And to me, this kind of means that the right wing has to stop this agreement that sort of exists where we will go to the bat for big capital all the time because we trip over ourselves every time that morality comes into it, where we go with the issue with YouTube. You got people saying, oh, well, it's their right. It's their right to do what they want with their property, and we just have to create this alternative space of our own if we want to do anything. But whenever we try to create that alternative, you have websites like Gab, where they've lost their banks 5 different times in the last 5 weeks because of what woke capital is doing to them. And it seems like we're in the situation where we defend the people who deplatform and attack us directly, and we're just kind of hogtied by our own ideals. And because we are unwilling to fight directly for things like our traditional family values and our religious views, and we prioritize these economic models so much, we're unable to take the stand that we need to take. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, we need to have some sort of change, and I think one of the things that actually did change, although Trump isn't in office anymore, is the Republican Party and its support of quote unquote Trumpism, right? And I know you and I had talked about this in our Facebook discussion group before, and what we were talking about was that the Republican Party does need, and conservatives in general need to shift a little bit and support workers more, like the working class. And it seems as if that shift actually is going to be entrenched now, even though Trump is no longer in office. This thing that he did, by sort of appealing to the lower classes and the working class, this shift is not going to go away. And I saw an interesting quote. It was from Ted Cruz, a few weeks ago, and right, he said, I think it was at CPAC, and he said, the Republican Party is a party of steel workers, construction workers, police officers, firefighters, waiters, waitresses, things like that. So he was basically saying exactly what we were saying, months ago, and that the Republican Party needs to shift a bit, and they do need to start, offering some solutions for your average everyday worker. And some of these solutions I think we have just talked about, not necessarily guaranteeing you a job and that you're not going to be fired, but, increasing protections with freedom of speech and freedom to associate, so that you won't get fired from your job in the future for having views that the company you work for does not explicitly support. So I do see a shift that happened under Trump that seems to just be entrenched now with conservatives in the Republican Party, and I hope that will continue, and I think there will be some changes in the horizon because of that.
Very well said. So I'm very happy with what we discuss today, but clearly this is a much bigger topic that we really are going to enjoy chewing on over the years to come. And I think it'll be quite soon the next time that we discuss conservatism and capitalism again. So with that, I would just like to say thank you to everyone who has made it this far. And I'll flip it over to you, Brandon, to close us out.
Yeah, I'd just like to close out by saying that I know the link to the article will be in the description of the video. I did kind of, like I said before, create this dichotomy of, okay, well, the author's talking about capitalism, so I've kind of compared it to communism. And I did that because, right, that really is, in my opinion, the only other options we have available right now. But I will also concede that the author does say at the end of this article that right now he does not have his version of capitalism explained. So because of that, that's sort of why I entered into this dichotomy. And he says that at a future time he will come out with that. So we will get a further explanation of what this capitalism is that he is talking about. And he does clearly say here that he is not talking about replacing capitalism with communism. So that wasn't his intention. So I am eager to see what type of capitalism he is talking about here. And perhaps we could even have a show about that in the future. Well, with that being said, I think we will finish now. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you guys next time on the Paleoconnection.